Summer break just got a lot more interesting. While Passive House Accelerator Live takes its annual pause in July and August, the Reimagine Buildings Collective is heating things up with Reimagine Summer. Every Tuesday, join our summer sessions. 90-minute conversations with leading building science experts, each breaking down 3 challenges and 3 solutions in their area of practice. We're talking heat pumps, decarbonization, resilience, bio-based materials, and more, with voices like Tommaso Leary, Christine Williamson, and Kritika Karbanda. Plus, hands-on summer labs and our summer reading club all summer long. Join the Reimagine Buildings Collective today and make this your best, better building summer yet.
Generally, we need to put cooling into the house we design now. I think it is becoming a thing that most people in the UK, I think, will be looking to have. It'll be kind of like central heating is the norm. I think cooling will be.
What if the buildings we construct today could solve the problems of tomorrow? Welcome to the Passive House podcast, where we explore the ideas, people, and practices transforming the way we build. Brought to you by Passive House Accelerator and the Reimagine Buildings Collective. Join a growing movement of builders, designers, and changemakers leveling up their practice and building the networks they need to thrive. Find free resources at passivehouseaccelerator.com and take it further inside the Reimagine Buildings Collective, our members-only community built for people serious about healthy, climate-ready buildings. Welcome back to the Passive House podcast. I'm Matthew Cutler, coming to you from Auckland in New Zealand, and I'm joined this week by Zach Semke. How you going, Zach?
I'm doing great. It's great to be back. It feels like it's been a little while.
It does feel, well, you've been busy. You've been out and about, attending lots of events and having a little bit of a holiday. So, yeah, good to see you again. And we've also got Mary James back with us. How have you been, Mary? How are things in your part of the world?
Oh, we've had our heat waves here, but
yeah,
at least we haven't had too much smoke, which is really way worse as far as I'm concerned than heat waves.
Yeah.
So I'd say it's been a good summer, and hopefully it'll continue to be a good summer.
And you've had some pretty hot weather as well in Seattle, Zach.
Yes, it has been hot and it is now smoky. Spokane in Eastern Washington just got, hit really hard by the wildfires. I think 700 buildings there were damaged. Many of them burned to the ground. So that event happened last weekend. So about a week ago. Actually, my family and I were doing some White River rafting over a 3-day period over the weekend in Eastern Oregon. So on Saturday, we were feeling these really strong winds that were actually at that moment blowing the smoke out of the valley that we were rafting through, which was something we were thankful for. But that same wind system was also kicking up, it was fanning the flames of the wildfires all around the region, including the one that hit Spokane. So that Spokane wildfire smoke has been blanketing Seattle this week and is starting to blow away. So yeah, it's kind of a drag.
Meanwhile, we've heard a lot about certainly the UK, Europe, India. I know is experiencing massive heat waves and quite a lot of associated fatalities with that as well. Yeah, it's really having a lot of impact. Meanwhile, we've had some frosts on the ground here in Auckland, which is pretty rare. And there's been snow in the main centres in the South Island and in Wellington. And I actually wrote a post yesterday talking about the need to, which seemed a little bit weird at the time because it was so cold here, but talking about the fact that we have nothing in our building code to require people to think about summer. And that's relevant to today's topic and the, much of what the North Hemisphere is experiencing at the moment, because typically our buildings don't deal with heat very well, particularly in places like the UK where they haven't had to traditionally. And that kind of makes things worse when things go even slightly above what is comfortable or healthy, which we're going to get into today with a really great conversation, Mary, you had with a couple of people, house designers in the UK. But before we get into that, we've got a few people to thank, Zach.
We sure do. So our sponsor of the week is Buwizo. So a big thank you to Buwizo for making everything possible here at the Passive House Accelerator for us this week, including this episode of the Passive House podcast. Thank you too to our stakeholder partner, NYSERDA, the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority. And thank you to our founding sponsors, 475 High Performance Building Supply, Ingui Architecture, Partel, Rockwell North America, and Zola Windows. And thank you to our champion sponsors, Bewizo, Cascadia Windows and Doors, DuraPanel, Icon Windows and Doors, Intus Windows, Proseco, Source 2050, and Zender.
So each year, the Passive House Institute organises some Passive House Open Days, or they promote Passive House Open Days, and it's often up to affiliates around the world to organise those. And they a winter one and a summer Passive House Open Days happened fairly recently. And Mary, you got in touch with, was it the Passive House Trust to find some people to talk to about that?
Yes, because that is, I contacted the Passive House Trust because I had read that there was a heat wave happening at the same time as the Passive House Open House Days, and I just wondered how it affected everybody's experiences there.
Yeah, which is a great question. And you did find two architects, designers to talk to. So let's dive into your conversation with Dominic and Alan from the UK.
I'm Mary James, and I'm here today with architect Dominic O'Riordan, architect in London and Passive House designer, and also Alan Budden, architect and founder of Eco Design Consultants. And they both participated in the Passive House Open House Days in June in the UK, and which coincided pretty much with a heat wave. I don't know if it was winding up during your open house days or just really building up, but it was hot. So I wanted to talk with each of them about their experience there at the open house days and generally how the changing climate is affecting their work. So first, Dominic, can you give us some background about yourself and your work and how you got involved with Passive House?
I became involved with Passive House basically one client who was very interested, very knowledgeable, and they asked me the questions that I wasn't able to answer. And in answering those questions, I ended up studying a Passive House course, taking the course in order to answer his questions. And then, it was great to find those answers to all of the questions that, I was struggling with at that time. And I met a very good group of people, amazingly knowledgeable group of people. And since then, it's formed a large part of my work. And I rely on it quite substantially for my information and design, that part of my design. Yeah, it's been invaluable to me. So I am a sole trading architect. We can't, I don't have a large body of information behind me. So having that source of information is fantastic to have. So that was that's how I got involved.
It's been at least a decade, right?
Yeah, but basically 2014. So 12 years.
Great. And Alan, can you give us a little bit of background about yourself and how you got involved with Passive House?
Sure. No, I first came across Passive House back in, I think it was 2006, when I was working for PRP Architects and I was designing a innovation house at the BRE Innovation Park for Stuart Milne. And it was designed at that point to be a Code 5 house, which was just the Code for Stable Homes was just coming out and was being launched. And so we were going to go for Code 5 on the thing. And I remember there, one of the people from the BRE talking to me about Passive House, and it's the first I came across it. And so it's kind of stored away in the back of my mind. And then back then in, I think, 2008, 2010, it was the first Passive House training course down at the BRE came along. And so I signed myself up and kind of been Passive House ever since. I think it is kind of a little bit of a movement in some ways, but great. Like Dominic was saying, lovely people, lovely sharing community, and really good building physics. And so that stayed with me. And to be honest, now build up the practice Eco Design Consultants, which I formed back in 2008, doing pretty much all Passive House stuff, both new build and retrofit.
And residential buildings mostly.
Mostly, yeah. We've done a little bit of dabble in a few other type of buildings, but mostly residential.
Dominic, you've done quite a few retrofits. I mean, because you work mostly in London, correct?
Yeah, in London we mostly have the existing fabric. There's not much. I mean, there is new. Amazing, there are spaces, but primarily it's existing building stock that I work with. So sometimes depending on the level of that people are going to, depends how far we can take it really. If we're doing a full house one, then we have a chance to really go for it. If they're not, then we can only do what we can and do it elementally. But that's quite a lot of people are you know buying houses and are prepared to do quite a lot of work to them. So there are opportunities to do full house retrofits. It's quite exciting and quite a challenge. I look forward to hearing about Robert. I think I've seen pictures of it before. But
for the open house days, you were in a new construction 2-story house. Is that correct?
Yeah. So the open house one is a house. It's actually for my mother, so I have very good access to it, and obviously I can show it for open house. Whereas it's not as easy to ask another client whether I can show people around their house for 2 days, solidly, and have everybody wander around every part of their house. And it's a lot easier. So that one was a new build house finished in 2022, 2023. Yeah, after a long planning process.
And as I understand it, it's a 2-story home, but because of planning constraints, it could only be 1 story tall. So
it's kind of an upside down house in terms of the living is at ground floor, entrance level, and we were replacing a former garage, and we were only allowed to go to that height. So it's a small house. It's 110 meters squared. It's not a large house, but even to get to that size, we had to have a second floor, and planning restrictions with listed buildings either side, we could only go down. So so the bedrooms are downstairs, and there's light wells front and back. It's not totally a basement, but that's the sort of configuration of it. And in the really peak, it was, in your question of what was the weather during the open house, it was about the peak of our heat wave. It was a Friday and a Saturday after a really hot week. Those 2 days were just about the max. Everything was boiling by that stage.
yeah. So we'll get back to in a minute your experience during the heat wave. But first, Alan, I wanted to hear a little bit about your building that you were in for the open house days.
Yeah, so we opened our house, myself and my wife, and we're retrofitting. So it's a 1977 house that we're retrofitting. We haven't quite finished yet. We're taking it slowly, but most of the work is done, to be honest, and it's well on the way to getting to NFIT. It's basically replaced the roof with some insulated roof cassettes with PV on top. We've done external wall insulation on the top half of the building, and we're now doing internal wall insulation on the inside of the lower part of the building. I think I just wanted to make things complicated for myself and try different things. So I kind of regret some of it, I think, now. So doing both. So the airtightness strategy was quite difficult, being inside and outside. So on the ground floor, it was a concrete floor. So we're having to chip up the cement, the screed on the floor, replacing it with some insulation and a floating floor. So I've done 2 out of 5 rooms downstairs, and there's a little bit of internal wall insulation left. Not a lot, to be honest, but we're pretty airtight now. We've got good triple glazed windows. We've got MVHR, so all the things that we need, and it's kind of just slowly doing a little bit of work when I can, weekends and stuff, just to try and finish things off a bit. So I think I'm down to about 45 kilowatts per square meter. So AECB standard.
Where is the house located?
Okay, very good question. We're in Milton Keynes, so north of London, basically between Oxford and Cambridge, which is quite nicely positioned for our clients. Often we have projects in Oxford and Cambridge, so quite lucky in that position. And it's in a sort of residential area with lots of trees. So I was quite fortunate having some trees, largest mature trees just outside of our garden that are able to shade the house which is useful.
And yes, shading and trees became an important part of your experience there during the open house days and living generally, I understand, in both your buildings. So, Dominic, can you talk a little bit about the shading and also your experience during the open house days event?
So we have showed the house before on a number of occasions, and they're described as winter and summer ones. And I think the winter ones are in November and the summer ones have been obviously in the summer, and they were in June. It was very topical to have had that at such a peak of the heat wave, mostly because it really focused your mind, whereas in the UK possibly we mostly focus on the idea of saving our energy, but to have had that whole 2 days essentially discussing the current heating elements of a passive house was a really good focus for the event. So our house, or the house that we were showing, is north-south located, which is quite handy. It has a shared party wall with a neighbouring property to the east and a blank facade to the west. So the north-south is quite good for being able to shade from the sun if you need to. We have 4 mature trees at the front. They're deciduous. They're fantastic, but they do leave a small gap, So when I looked at it from about 12:30 to 3:30, we do get the full glare of the midsummer sun at midday, at that portion of the afternoon, which is, that is a lot of heat. That was a lot of heat gain. So we did ask in the planning process to have external shading devices, but the conservation officer, quite a sensitive area. They didn't wish to introduce shading devices, and they said there was no precedent and asked us to remove those. So we have removed those, and we did change the design slightly. So we have a very deep reveal on the front south-facing elevation, so that we have 9-inch brick and then plus a little bit extra before you get to the windows. So in the midsummer, we do get quite a steep angle, and it does take out about 1/3 of the window. But we are left with 2/3 at the bottom. And I think, if summers like this happen again, we are going to have to put something on the outside to shield it. We did design the windows to open inwards, so it's quite easy to install external shading devices without snagging the windows. The basement never, always feels like quite a nice cool temperature. It doesn't overheat, it just stays very constant. The windows are smaller, and obviously it doesn't have a large roof space above it that's taking quite a bit of exposure. So yeah, going forward, and there were quite a few of us staying in the house that week. So my 2 sons were there. They were all working on their laptops. My mother was there. It was quite an intense. We were all generating our own heat and trying to get rid of it. And we did all start studying the summer bypass and its features on the MVHR to try and cool the upper floors. And there are 2 roof lights which we went and covered up to block the sun from those. So it's very interesting to see, and I'm very interested to hear Alan's one of aiming for 0 overshading as opposed to the qualifying of not going over 10% of overheating. I'm going to aim much lower for the overheating. I think it's, aiming at that 10% now that we're having that kind of heat it won't just go over 25 by 1 degree, it will go over 25 by 5 degrees. The sun was fierce. It was quite something.
And 25, just for our audience, is around 77 degrees Fahrenheit, which is warm, definitely, for indoors, especially with more people in the house than usual.
Yeah,
and you don't have air conditioning.
No, it's very uncommon to have air conditioning in residential properties here. There was a lot of discussion during those open house days about cooling via the MVHR or having air source heat pumps that can be flipped to cooling in the summer. And the next property I look at will be looking at whether air to air what the implications of that for the winter heating as opposed to the. But yeah, it would have been very nice to have had some cooling for that period. So that's definitely being. There's a lot more conversations around that, and obviously, if you have solar panels, at that moment they should be working at peak power. So it would be interesting to see whether that can be incorporated into houses without hugely increasing the energy use. So,
Alan, can you tell us a little about your experience during the Stays event?
Yeah, I think very similar to Dominic, really. I think the issues are that, particularly that weekend, where it wasn't really cooling down that much at night. So the purge venting, there was some. It wasn't that much. So you obviously during the day you're building up with some sun coming in. We're at the rear of our house, where most of the windows are, is kind of southwest facing. So there is sun coming in. Our main lounge has got large patio doors. Generally, we have a big sunshade outside on the table, so we just put that up when it's hot, and that works brilliantly. But some of the other rooms don't. The worst room is probably the one I'm in at the moment, which is the study, where we've got kind of a little projection with 3 little windows on 3 or a long slot window, really, that the sun comes in, and it's usually a warm room where there's computers and people and all the other things. I've got a server here and all sorts of stuff. So it's not. It does get the warmest, but it's still much better than elsewhere. So we did get up to, I think, 28 degrees at that period, which, to be honest, compared to outside, was lovely and still perfectly acceptable. So I think there is some bits there I want to do, but I think very much like Dominic's saying, there's a lot of discussions around cooling. It's something that the UK has sort of generally not had. There is, unfortunately, a big move, just the general public now, to look towards air conditioning. Some of my neighbours have had air conditioning put in to their houses, and it's starting to become much more common. This year again, I think even more so, with some of the portable units and stuff going in, which work terribly. And so yeah, I think there is a need. And then some of the more recent retrofits we've done have done air-to-air heating, so they're just easily put some cooling on. I think one of our first projects, which I was kind of surprised at, our client, who was probably the greenest person I've ever met in terms of carbon, fantastic guy. He really wanted to make sure everything he did was the lowest carbon. So he was even down to who he gets to survey the house has to come a short distance and all the rest of it. He's now got cooling and uses it. He was kind of in the past to be the last person I would have thought to use any form of electricity, but because he's got PV on the roof, hey, it's free. It sits there. It's not any extra carbon. So actually, some cooling from while using your PV isn't so bad, maybe compared to the breezelays and other things. So it's a bit of a mind changer, because in the UK, it's always been, in environmental stuff, it's very much been that air conditioning is kind of the work of the devil, and as sustainability consultants, we should never consider such a nasty thing. But in reality, an air conditioning unit is just a heat pump. So it's fairly efficient compared to other things if it's done properly. So yeah, so putting in cooling. So a lot of our newer buildings now, we do design them in. And in fact, over the last month, I've had a few phone calls from our old passive houses we've done. So there's one which we had a little bit of overheating on it. We did our best to try and keep it down, but they want to put an air conditioning unit in, mainly because they can't necessarily always purge vent, because they've got a life and they're out and about, and so they can't go and open the windows at 7 o'clock in the morning when it's cold. And so their house did overheat a little bit during that period. So they're looking to put it in, and they've got PV on the roof. So is it such a bad thing as long as they don't damage the air tightness and so forth, and we can make sure it's not overly done?
The temperatures you guys are talking about are, I think a lot of people here who are more used to air conditioning. I don't have air conditioning either, but they'd be reaching for their air conditioner when you're anything above 75 degrees Fahrenheit. I think a lot of people consider that to be pretty warm. And especially, as you said, it didn't cool down as much at night, which is always the hard part, I think.
It was very humid as well. It wasn't a kind of a dry heat. It was a very humid heat, and it was much much harder to kind of keep, working, everybody was struggling just to get on with their their daily lives were just, it was a lot, it was a lot harder to get on, and everybody's kind of just realizing quite the impact that it can have. It was almost worse than cold. It was just quite debilitating in terms of its impact. So it was bound to have a big effect. And hope, as Alan says, there's a lot of conversations about it. It should be required in all schools and all, maximum work temperatures, and I think that these conversations are sort of ongoing now, whereas previously it was almost, they just, in our climate it wasn't really an issue. It's also an issue of houses getting smaller and these rooms heating up quite quickly, whereas a much nicer, larger space, taller ceilings is a lot better, but we have quite small space standards here, and it's quite, they heat up fast.
And just briefly, if one of you wants to talk to air source heat pumps that don't provide cooling, because I think we're more used to the type here that can do both. So just
Want me to jump in on that
take
one?
that on.
Yeah, I think the problem is because of that kind of attitude of air conditioning being the work of the devil, and that's run through some of our grant systems and stuff. So initially there was a grant system to provide heat pumps in the UK to encourage people to do it, and on those you couldn't have cooling, so all the manufacturers would disable the cooling to be able to get the grant. So that's more recently changed, and now also you can get small grant for the air-to-air heat pumps, which again previously you couldn't. So it was kind of the government trying to catch up, really, that kind of led us to not have those facilities. So obviously cooling is difficult because of condensation. I'm sure you know all that stuff, but it's trying to get that to work in a sensible way is another big learning curve that we're going to have to go through in the UK, that we're not going to end up having condensation dripping off pipes because they just decided to switch it to cooling and carry it through. So there's a lot of detail that's needed. And again, I think we just need to emphasize that we need to get the building physics right first. And it's not just a case now of designing a building and sticking a heat pump in and to manage any size of glazing or whatever. So we need to get glazing ratios right first, and shading and all the other building fabric stuff before we think about cooling. It's not the panacea, even though, to be honest, more recently I've been looking at various PHEPs, and if you make the windows slightly bigger and stuff, it's slightly easier to get your heating demands to work. So there's a kind of tendency to try and do that, to then say, okay, well, that's fine because I can put the cooling in. But it's those extremes that we kind of need to work with to get to balance, which is kind of fascinating and interesting. But yeah, there's all sorts of ways of, I've been talking with my friend Rod about how we can kind of retrofit different buildings and whether we should put in little portable units or put in units that are going to put coolant into the air. So I think Zender do some nice comfort cool posts where you can put your cool water feed from your heat pump into it to then provide cool air coming out through the MVHR with a condensation trap and stuff, or whether you're trying to do it through radiators and other bits and pieces, or that's another unit with maybe some fan core units, or maybe it's a combination of all of the different elements. But it's kind of then thinking about how you're going to make those extra penetrations back out through and how you get the heat out and all the rest of it, which is kind of a whole thing that in the UK we're not really used to. And it's interesting, but it's small demand if we do it right.
Right, that's the big important point to make, is that if you do it right, then the demand is much smaller and you can do more easily provide cooling through your ventilation system, if you've taken the fabric first approach.
Yeah, the difficulty with the ventilation option is that the ventilation is designed for the amount of ventilation you need for the rooms, not necessarily the amount of cooling or heating you need. So we're kind of finding that using a ventilation system isn't the right answer. I mean, here in my house, the roof panels were supposed to have solar thermal underneath the PV, and we were going to use that hot water to do various things and try it. Unfortunately, it's a test house. That didn't work for various reasons, which I won't go into. But What it did mean is that I had a post heater already installed, and I did have insulated ducts from there. So it was quite interesting when I put my heat pump in to have it as an extra add-on, so I could turn that on and see how it worked. And interestingly, it was quite difficult to control the heat just using that. I'd find that the bedrooms would get very hot and other rooms were getting cold because of the flow rates of the ventilation. So what I've ended up doing is saying, okay, if it's really cold, I'll put that on as well as the radiators, and I can have maybe the radiator in some rooms turned off. Particularly, I found that the bedrooms, because we're in it, it gets warm overnight anyway, so that's enough heat, so it doesn't need to be on. And having that just through the ventilation was enough to give a little bit of a background boost to make sure that the COP of the heat pump was really nice and low. So that was quite useful, but it did make me realize that really trying to do mix between the heat or cool through the ventilation is kind of difficult if you want to get rooms to balance. And unfortunately, when you're in a passive house, you get fussy. And 1 or 2 degrees difference is fussy.
Yeah, it will be interesting to see. I remember when I was doing my course, and when the sort of original sort of cartoon of somebody throwing their radiators out and just using their VHR for heating, and they said it just became quite hard to do all the heating via air. It was quite a complicated system, and they couldn't quite, it did become easier just to have a sort of a heat source as opposed to trying to move air around and control it. And so it didn't quite work out as planned. But
in retrospect, there's always things that you could have done differently or might have done differently. I wonder if, thinking about the heat waves, well, Dominic, you mentioned that you wanted to put shading, but you couldn't get permission to do that.
I mean, definitely, I think the planners now wouldn't have the same attitude that they had then. Everybody understands the dangers of overheating. And now, yeah, you can never fully, second guess what planners are going to say to you. And even if I had something that I clipped on for, had an easy system, it's a ground floor window. It's not hard to get to. I can clip something on to the external wall, and I would imagine that would be very unusual for somebody to go to their length of saying that. So I would definitely put some external shading, either a screen or a louver, brise-soleil type, purely for overheating. It would cut out very little window, but would cut out the sun that we're worried about quite easily. So yeah, I would do that. I think overall, I think I probably, now probably I would definitely try to, at planning stage, try to argue the case for not going down to a basement. Just, the whole emphasis of moving away from embodied carbon is, once you have a basement, you have an enormous embodied carbon from day one. So, I think I would have to be much stronger at the planning stage. That basic first move, have to put a lot more emphasis on trying to have the design at a stage where it's not going to require that. And whether we make it or not, but at least, fight harder than I did in terms of going to 2 stories, right, above ground rather than going below. But apart from that, I think it's it's a very nice house. But those are the things, if I was thinking again what I would do, those are the one's easy and one's hard, but that's the 2 things.
And how about you, Alan? Is there anything, I mean, you're still working away on your house, but
I mean, I think I'm going to put a little bit of a shading more on my study, partly because, to be honest, even in autumn and winter, the sun's quite low and it comes in a bit of glare if I'm in the study. So a little bit of just a simple, I think I'm going to have 2 little poles with a bit of fabric. Nothing particularly fancy, just going out horizontally. Doesn't need to be very big, but it's not a particularly deep window. But I think that I'll probably do at some point. And I think it's a shame with the heat pump, because the one I've got doesn't have cooling. Some of them do. So it'd be interesting, Dominic, to know which one you've got, because I know some of them you can actually get kits now to convert to cooling, or some of them it's kind of turn off the disabling bit that had it originally. So there are things that maybe could do. I'd quite like to put a bit of cooling as well into mine, because I've got the post heater, so it'd be quite nice to get some form of cold water into that, but I haven't quite worked out the best way of doing that yet. But I'd also need to do some sort of external device, whether that's going to be a small air conditioning unit with the hoses going out the window. I've wondered about putting it into the exhausts and intake of the MVHR, but then that's going to be the wrong flow rates, and it's all, yeah, it all gets quite kind of complicated in how that will work. But
it's good that it's yours.
Yeah, exactly. You can. I'd love to play around with it and see what it can do.
Yeah, yeah. We should all have our own ones to play with. It's very hard to play with somebody else's ones, and then they come back and.
Indeed.
And it's pretty amazing in some respects, and in others not that surprising, but how quickly the climate is changing and affecting, both of you guys as clients and their interest in preventing overheating. And I just wondered if there were any final thoughts that you had, Alan, about how your clients are, if they are talking to you more, and how you're addressing these concerns more.
I think generally we need to put cooling into the house we design now. I think it is becoming a thing that most people in the UK, I think, will be looking to have cooling in the house. It'll be kind of like central heating is the norm. I think cooling will be, which is kind of a shame. But I think with our houses, you'll be just using a small amount of cooling, so that's no big deal. And it is the other bit that kind of final I want to say is there's been a bit of press in the UK recently to say that there's a real problem with adding insulation to houses and that it causes overheating, which is clearly, if you know your building physics and passive house, and most people listening to this will understand it's not the case. But there's really quite a big move to that, mainly because we have got fairly good, well-insulated houses now, and they haven't got any ventilation systems. They haven't got any proper cooling strategy. People in the UK don't understand about night purging and when to close the windows. They'll have the windows open all the time and all the rest of it. So it's a whole exercise I think we need to go through in terms of education and around how these things work in the UK, because we're just not used to it. But I think we need to design it now for that, because people can expect it. And if we link it with PV, it's not a big bad thing for the environment. So that's kind of what I would say. And there's also just one last thing, which is quite interesting. There's quite interesting things. If you did put a air-to-air heat pump in, you then have to deal something with your hot water. So there's some quite nice units with heat pumps on that bring in air from the outside. And I know as Tresda up in Scotland, he's not plumbed his unit in to the outside. I think maybe I shouldn't say this, but I think partly because he didn't want to drill the hole. But but his machine is working really great because it hasn't got the holes through the fabric, so it's not losing heat in the winter, and it's not losing the air tightness around it at all. But he's then having to slightly put more heat into the air to then take it out for the hot water. But now it means that unit is blowing out cold air to make the hot water, which is fantastic. So little things like that might be ways we can do that. So we can have the cold air from the heat pump in the house while we're producing hot water. I'm not quite sure how that will work yet, but I think there's things that could be developed, and there's the compact units and all sorts of things that are coming. But interesting times.
Yes.
Yeah, I really look forward to seeing how the really clever people manage to, think it all through and solve it. I think it will be, geniuses will be on the case. But as Passive House, I think we can't say that you can't have cooling, because otherwise people will ignore us and they'll go somewhere else. So we have to be in on the conversation and include it and have a strategy for it. And the houses are beautifully set up for it. They might need some adapting, but they won't need massive adapting. So I think it's very good that we are on the case of it. Some, we have to take these as a, an indicate, a sort of sign, good sign to focus on that element as well in this part of the world.
It's a great note to end on. Thank you both for your time, and indeed for opening up your homes to get people to understand better about building physics and what you can do to try and adapt to our changing times.
And that was Dominic and Alan coming to us from their own homes in the UK. Really great that you did reach out, Mary. I think it's a very relevant topic and obviously very timely with some of those heat events that, well, they've sort of been continuous series of heat waves across the UK and Europe. So really interesting to talk about people experiencing those in a passive house and some of the technical things that they're thinking about in relation to that and what they might do again differently next time. What were your main takeaways from that?
Well, I guess my main takeaway was how fast the climate is changing in the UK. It's just the relevance of cooling, mechanical cooling, is just shifted so drastically. I mean, there was Alan talking about, oh, we used to think of it as the work of the devil. And honestly, the temperatures that they're talked about in their homes by our standards are, that they were saying, well, that's sort of tolerable. It's like 26 degrees to me is quite warm.
Yeah.
To be inside.
Yeah, absolutely.
So yeah, they're having to make changes pretty quickly in response to how warm things are there.
Yeah, and in the same way that we see storm events and rainfall events happening more and more frequently, I think we're seeing these more extreme heat waves happen more and more recently. So yeah, it's not uncommon to have a few hot days, but to have so many of them and so have these records smashed so regularly, I think that's pointing to that acceleration that you mentioned, and it is coming fast. And I think I've thought about this quite a lot, having grown up in Australia, South Australia, Adelaide, where it's pretty common to get days or weeks of 40-degree plus heat. But that's happened so over the last few decades, and I think people are more set up to be able to cope with that. And I know, having been in the UK and in Europe, there's some of those cities, they're just, the buildings are very solid. They're very heavy materials, lots of stone, masonry, very little shading, very little greenery in some areas, and just no cooling. So a slight variance above 25 degrees in those situations can be worse, I think, than in other places where they're more used to dealing with even higher temperatures, but therefore have mitigation strategies to be able to cope with that. And that's going to be a bit of a transition, I think, for some of those areas to deal with those higher temperatures. I think it was a really interesting point about the 10% threshold for Passive House. Passive House designers in Australia and New Zealand never use that 10% threshold. They always design for, at least the ones that I talk to, they target below 5% generally, some more around 3 or 4%, because we know that 10% exceedance of 25 degrees is not really acceptable, especially as they pointed out in this interview, that doesn't distinguish between whether it's 1 degree above 25 degrees or 5, 10, 15 degrees above. It's just any time above that, and it can be quite uncomfortable for that period of time. So yeah, we typically aim for between a maximum of 3 and 5% over 25 degrees in our modelling in this part of the world. Lots of interesting stuff in there. But Zach, what did you think?
Well, I really related to Dominic and Alan because, Seattle is sort of like a sister climate to the UK, with all the rain during much of the year and then very mild summers. And so this, realization like, oh, wow, we're not in Kansas anymore with our summers, and we need to be thinking about AC is something that our whole region has been going through over the years. And, it's not just that we're gradually getting hotter and hotter. It's also when we have these really extreme events like in Seattle, what really opened up everybody's eyes and was kind of really rocked our world was the heat dome in 2021, where in Seattle, our high temperature, and we were cooler actually than parts of British Columbia and Portland, Oregon. But in Seattle, our high temperature was 108 degrees during that heat dome, which is 42 Fahrenheit. So that's 42 degrees Celsius. And we're just absolutely not prepared for that.
Yeah.
And so, cooling is definitely something that people need now. So that transition is underway and really important. I was struck by the fact that the heat pump, the government incentive, I guess, in the UK for heat pumps required them to disable the AC part. And now they're, it's like, it was a different time. That was just a different time,
Yeah,
a different
it was a different
understanding.
time. Yeah.
And I appreciated I think that there is this understanding also that at least we have this coincidence. They happen at the same time. These extreme heat events happen when we can also be generating a lot of solar energy. So
Yep.
that I think is at least one good good
Yeah.
alignment in this whole
Yeah.
story.
And that's common
Yeah.
in Australia right now, where you get these
Yeah.
really, and with over 30% of homes in Australia now have solar PV on their roofs. So in summertime, there's a lot of generation happening,
Yeah.
which can then be used directly for mechanical cooling. I think the other big change for mechanical cooling is that it wasn't that long ago where the refrigerants were a real concern for global warming potential, and that is changing rapidly as well. And we're seeing a proliferation of CO2 heat pumps, which have a global warming potential literally of 1, because it's CO2 is
That's the
metric
benchmark.
for that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep.
So, some of the older refrigerants, which, in some parts are still in use, they have global warming potentials of thousands of, of times worse than that. So air conditioning was a concern, and it's still, we still don't want to just use it willy-nilly. And I was really pleased to hear them talk about the importance of the envelope first. Making buildings more energy efficient is going to help. And that's also a really common misconception that they talked about, this public belief that insulation is what's causing overheating. And we've had exactly that happen here, where we've ratcheted up the insulation requirements of our building code. Things are getting warmer, and then suddenly the general populace point to that insulation standard as being the cause of houses getting warmer. And we need to push back against that, because it's not true, but I can see where people associate those two things.
Yeah, it is a communications challenge, and we need to rise to it. I mean, the thermos analogy is something that has traditionally been used to explain the thermal barrier of buildings and in Passive House. And obviously, a thermos can keep liquid hot or liquid cold. It's really about creating a barrier between the thermal barrier between what's inside and outside. So that's the big important point. And the nuance, of course, is that we have windows in our buildings, and so we have solar gain. And then also most of the things inside our buildings, like people and pets and appliances and all that, do create some heat. The heat pump water heater is an exception to that. So we also need to, I think, be smart, get smarter and smarter about how we are designing our buildings. It was really interesting also to hear again. I mean, again, a sign of the times changing was that initially that external shading was not allowed, which unfortunately it sounds like that wouldn't be the case today.
Yeah.
But that seems unwise given what we're grappling with.
Mary, did you say that you don't have mechanical cooling at your place?
I do not. And, it's a great point about insulation. We have had recently a heat wave where it was, in the high 90s here. And my house never got hotter than 73 inside.
Wow.
Right.
That's all insulation.
Yeah. Yeah.
But your house is a relatively old house, right?
But I did a Passive House retrofit on it in 2010. And it's paid off in spades for me.
But does that also mean that not solely because of its age, but I'm assuming that it's not a glass box. You don't have massive windows.
I don't have massive windows, but I have some large windows. I mean, there were some really large single pane windows, and I changed the openings a little bit, but not hugely. And I have exterior shading on one part of my house. I wish I had it on the other part, but it was just a little bit expensive to do the whole thing. That's on the east facing side.
Yeah.
And I appreciated that both these people were lucky enough to have mature trees in front of their house, because I've lived here a long time, and the trees that were here have gotten bigger, and it's had a very positive effect on me for heat waves, especially if we have a heat wave, I really notice a difference between having a heat wave in June because of where the sun is and how much it bombards my house, and having a heat wave in, say, late August or September.
Right.
And
Yeah.
the sun's lower.
The trees really make a huge difference. So
Yeah. Yeah.
This whole question about the heat island effect and air conditioning is one that we were all discussing before we started taping here. And I wanted to share a couple of things. One is there's a really interesting article by David Wallace Wells in the New York Times from July 1st called "We Need to Retrofit the Planet. The Heat Wave Proves It." And in it, he's identifying the fact that there's kind of slow adoption of air conditioning in Europe, which makes these heat waves tougher to handle. And partly that's just because Europe has traditionally been cooler, and there's also some this sense that there's some cultural pushback on air conditioning. But what I was curious about is that I've been hearing this argument that AC is a big contributor to the heat island effect. So I was how much? What is this? Is this a really big deal? And a quick Google search suggests that indeed it is. And that the Arizona State University study found that there's a more than 1 degree Celsius average temperature rise in outside nighttime temperatures in major cities like Phoenix because of the air conditioning. And then there's another paper in Science Direct that suggests that in high density neighborhoods where you have these narrow urban canyons with poor ventilation, that the local street level temperature rise can reach 2.5 degrees to 7.7 degrees Celsius. So that's 4.5 degrees Fahrenheit to 14 degrees Fahrenheit higher, entirely due to the clustered AC exhaust units. So it is a thing. And this is another reason that we should continue to be focused on the quality of our buildings themselves and the building envelope, so we can make sure that these AC units don't have to be huge and make the heat island effect that much worse in our cities during these events.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's the benefit of doing modeling as a cost benefit exercise and using things like Wi-Fi passive or PHPP and really scaling up the insulation, looking at the shading, looking at the windows and the glazing specification so that you can reduce the size of the plant. We hear that it's a very common strategy in large commercial buildings where you can spend a bit more on the envelope and reduce the plant size. And the same applies for smaller residential homes where you can just up spec the windows and the walls and the roof. And then you might still need some air conditioning and some heating and cooling, but it could be a lot less, particularly if you have it running on solar as well. Awesome stuff. I'm sure that there's a lot more to discuss on all of these aspects, because we didn't really touch on ventilation, the summer bypass. We could talk for a whole session probably just on glass specification. I think this, how we deal with warmer temperatures globally, particularly with regards to Passive House, is going to be an ongoing conversation. There's been a lot of content and discussion on it already, and there'll be a lot more to come. So thank you for that, Mary. Really good stuff. Zach, what have we got coming up over at the Accelerator and Reimagine?
Yeah, so the Accelerator is still on summer break for the Passive House Accelerator live series. So we'll at the first Wednesday of September, we'll get going on again on that. But programming is very active inside the Reimagine Buildings Collective and lots of really fun conversations. We have a whole series of different Reimagine labs that are underway and that are very vibrant and fun. So we'll be doing some reporting out of the findings from those labs in September. But this week on Wednesday, August 12th, we have an open lab within the Reimagine Buildings Collective for members of the collective on heat pump solutions. So this is we're doing a series of these heat pump solution open labs this summer, and this one is focused on mid-size, multifamily, and light commercial buildings. So all of it, heat pumps is very apropos to the conversation we were just having. So we're going to have Jordan Bonomo from NYCHA, the New York City Housing Authority, Cameron Kaja of Positive Energy, and Galen Stengel of Stengel Engineering, each presenting a heat pump solution for mid-sized buildings. And then the lab attendees will then be kind of stress testing these solutions and thinking about how they apply to their own work and how they might not and what their obstacles are. So we'll have a really fun, dynamic conversation about those challenges and exploration of potential solutions that are, I mean, the labs have just been definitely a highlight of my work inside the Reimagine Buildings Collective. And so this is kind of the next step. We're stepping this one up with these open labs. So if folks are interested, become a member of the collective. It's fun in there.
Nice. Awesome. Yeah, lots of great content in there. Go and check it out. Thank you very much. Thanks again, Mary, and good to see you both. We'll be back again next week on the Passive House Podcast.